Donc, aujourd'hui, on a le grand plaisir d'accueillir Arnold Dreyblatt. Cette prise de parole aujourd'hui a plus d'un titre assez exceptionnel. D'abord, Arnold, à ma connaissance, n'est jamais venu rendre compte de son travail, parler de son travail en France. Donc on est particulièrement honoré de l'invitation que Julien Maire lui a faite et qu'il a acceptée. Ensuite, cette prise de parole, elle est assez exceptionnelle pour une deuxième raison, c'est qu'elle aura lieu en anglais. On n'en a pas beaucoup l'habitude ici. Et exceptionnelle aussi parce que Arnold a accepté d'intervenir non pas une, deux, mais trois fois. Parce que Arnold mènera une conférence dans quelques minutes sur une partie de son travail. Ce soir, Arnold jouera au conservatoire Pierre Barbizet à 20h pour un concert qualifierait également d'exceptionnel puisque ça fait 12 ans qu'Arnold n'a pas joué à Marseille. Et demain, Arnold interviendra une troisième fois au Laude à 14h. Alors pourquoi trois fois On m'entend pas bien. Alors pourquoi trois fois? Parce qu'il nous semblait important avec Julien de donner à Arnold tout un espace d'expression pour rendre compte, partager avec vous plusieurs pratiques concomitantes dans son œuvre, puisque depuis 40 ans, Arnold est non seulement artiste, pédagogue, mais aussi compositeur. Et ce que Arnold nous disait encore hier soir lors d'un dîner avec Julien, c'est que peu de ses collègues enseignants artistes sont familiers de son travail de composition, et inversement, peu de ses collègues musiciens ont connaissance de son travail d'installation d'œuvres multimédias, lors même que l'une et l'autre se nourrissent en permanence. Donc ça nous semblait aussi important de lui donner cet espace, pouvoir partager son travail de pédagogue, d'artiste visuel, mais aussi de musicien, à l'aune des conversations actuelles que l'on peut avoir au sein de l'INSEAM, puisqu'on travaille à nourrir un peu ce lien entre les pratiques sonores et musicales et visuelles. Et là, on a vraiment un parfait exemple d'artiste / compositeur qui peut déplier un petit peu l'ensemble de ces pratiques. Je vais faire court. Je vais juste préciser donc le titre de la conférence qu'Arnold va nous donner maintenant s'appelle « From the Archives ». Donc a davantage trait à son travail d'installation d'œuvres multimédia. Et pour rappel, donc ce soir, 19h30, en entrée libre, le concert au conservatoire Pierre Barbizet de Arnold. Le concert commencera à 20h. Demain, Arnold nous parlera plutôt d'un autre aspect de son travail, qui est celui de la pédagogie, puisqu'il nous parlera du travail en archives et travail pédagogique qu'il a mené pendant plusieurs années autour des archives du Black Mountain College. Cette intervention aura lieu à 14h au Laude, elle sera également en langue anglaise. Mais j'en dis pas plus, et je laisse la parole à Arnold, et j'éteins les lumières.
That's it? Okay, I'm on. Hello, I'm very happy to be here. I'm very sorry that I can't speak to you in French. My work tends to require a bit of explanation, so I will talk, but I will also show you images and some short videos in presenting the different projects. So here I just outlined for you the structure, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and then works which I loosely define as media installation with some exceptions, my work in public art and also in performance. As Maxime mentioned, there's a musical performance tonight. I'm not going to go into my practice in music or in composition now because we have a limited time, but I'm here in residence for the next days, and if someone is interested, either tonight after the concert or tomorrow or Thursday, feel free to come and speak to me. So I, just to say something about my own biography, I've been living in Europe since 1983, mostly in Berlin, in Germany. I was born in New York, and I've been active as a composer and artist over all of these years. And this moment is a bit of a closing of a circle, because I just a few weeks ago ended my last semester of teaching as a professor for media art in an art academy in Germany, in Kiel, near Denmark. And 13 years ago, my first guest was Julien Maire. So, we lost touch a bit as he left Berlin. He was living in Berlin at the time, and suddenly came this invitation. So I think it's a nice circle that I'm now invited here to Marseille. In terms of my background, I originally studied media art in one of the earliest media or centers for media art as an educational institution in Buffalo, New York, where I studied with Woody and Steen and Vasulka. And at that time, I began experimenting with translation of sound and image, very much influenced by the Vasulkas. Interestingly, I also started taking courses also in music at that time. Was a very strong presence of composers and also of American experimental filmmakers and early video artists. I began to develop a video practice with early video images, which were partially controlled by sounds and resulted in what I would call stroboscopic color images. This is an image from a work that I did in 1974. Interestingly, these original, they were actually tapes, were lost and recently rediscovered, and were also over the last few years renovated at CKM in Karlsruhe in Germany and digitized. As I said, I'm not going to go deeply into my work as a composer now, but I can just say that my compositional activities have run parallel to my work as an artist since the mid-1970s, and where I began developing a music based on the relationship of a fundamental tone to its component harmonics, and both as a solo performer and in an ensemble format, and also in the area of sound installation. So, is that visible? Okay, the projection is not so strong, but I hope that with the lights out that you can see something. I'm going to talk I sort of frame this talk around a certain body of work, and I should say that my artistic practices have been realized in a very wide diversity of formats, presentation formats, and media contexts over the last 40 years. Actually, I'm not actually sure how many years it is, but it's a long time. Music composition, as I said, sound art, contemporary opera, and in theater context, performance as mass public readings, and installations with digital and non-digital media, and also artistic research projects, some of which were carried out in collaboration with my students. And more than 30 years ago, I began an artistic project which is mostly text-based. I mean, you will see this, and which has continued to be based on found historical source material, sometimes biographical, but most often original archive documents. So the title of this lecture, From the Archive, is actually a title of a work of mine, but it somehow is a title which reflects on the work that I'm going to show. And over many years, during a process of deconstruction and reconstruction of these texts, the work broadened from an interest in perhaps a particular historical dimension to really look at the subject of archiving and archival storage itself. You know, how we write and store our histories and narratives as an individual and as a culture. And here maybe because the archive the term archival or archive in the art world has taken on many different meanings over the last 20, 30 years. And my work has been especially focusing, especially in its early stages, focusing on the institutional archive. Yeah, so the archive as an institution and how that functions. I've tried to pose questions about how the different institutions, whether it's libraries or museums or archives themselves, and also the different technologies, whether it's digital or paper or how we use the different the various methodologies, life writing, biography, history, basically how we try to store the past, and what does that mean for us. It's kind of I like to say a battle against forgetting or against loss, and but then we or the institutions are not always. There's always a question of what should be saved and what should be left untouched. And over the years, you will see in the work various metaphors, also visual metaphors that I've used, and conceptual metaphors from the very beginning as this project began, looking at what I call the endless text, a text without boundaries, taken from an infinite number of documents. The document as a focus has also been played an important part, and then also looking at the digital retrieval of information. So the database, we basically live now in a database culture, and so the infinite text or the bottomless archive, the bottomless database. And then in various spatial metaphors of circular formats or a landscape, transparency, overlapping layers. I often think of the metaphor of the grain of sand. So a particular, like when you think of the beach, as if you could focus on one grain of sand as representing a detail of information, and then the whole beach as somehow losing its own identity. So we will see this also in a number of works, also questions about readability or legibility, and so the reader, or let's say the audience interaction, the interaction of the viewer, is extremely important. So, whereas the interaction can also mimic the actual content in the work itself. And then just lastly, in many of the works, I've created databases from archival material. In some cases, the work is my own initiative in terms of, and they often entail or involve a large period of research, but there are also many works which are commission works, or where an institution or someone in the world asks me to or let's offer as a body of material and sort of is interested what I might do with it. So, I start with this slide. I mean, I don't know if this is going to make sense to you, but I like to start with a story. I like to tell stories. This slide, you can read "Memory Lost" on it. And back in the 90s, I was with my wife on a vacation in Sicily in a small fishing town, Shaka. No tourists at all. And we would sit and have our coffee in the piazza in the center of this little town. And there was this display, "Memory Lost," quite large. What you don't see here is that it was empty, and then every few seconds, like I think it was about 30 seconds, suddenly these letters would come across, letter by letter, and then they would stay for another 30 seconds and then disappear again. And I just assumed it was some kind of an art piece. And I started asking around if anybody knew who made this. And yeah, so as one questions what, or is excited to find in this tiny place, which seemed to have very little to do with the art world, who placed it there in this very prominent place. And after sitting there day after day and looking at it, I suddenly realized on my last day that actually it was the chip inside that had lost its memory, and it was just announcing itself. So as if to say, my memory is lost, so it was actually an advertisement for some shop or something, and at some point it couldn't access its memory, and there was a message, announcing that the memory was lost. And it was fascinating because people told me it was there for years and just showing this sign. So I actually used it I photographed it and used it as and actually made a work from the photograph, and it seems to be symbolic of my project. So just to tell you how I began, so in the 1980s I spent a lot of time traveling in Eastern Europe, and when I first came to Berlin, of course it was a different Europe. Okay, it's also a different Europe now over the last few weeks, but I happened to find a book in a used bookstore in Istanbul called Who's Who in Central and East Europe. It was a biographical dictionary with 10,000 biographies of people who were important then and were later forgotten, and it fascinated me. And it was published in 1933, so a year in which Europe actually never was the same again, and something happened, and many of these people emigrated, were killed, maybe survived in various forms, but I began a project looking at this text, and it's actually quite expensive in those days in Turkish lira, but I eventually bought it and began a number of different projects. The first project was what I called a hypertext opera. Hypertext is now a terminology which reflects on how we basically search the World Wide Web and all information, but at that time hypertext was a literary metaphor and was a point of discussion in literary circles. It was a way of organizing information in a nonlinear fashion, so very much having to maybe something to do with how we think of information in the arts in terms of collage and putting unrelated information together. And this was a proscenium performance in a theater context. I actually became, for a short time, a bit famous in the theater world. I'm going to look later at some of my performative projects, but I'm showing this now, just some images from it. I think, here's another image, just to show the beginnings of the project. And in this case, I had developed a kind of digital libretto based on a particular pathways through this book of 10,000 biographies. I actually worked with 800 biographies. Finally, I got support for a research project for a number of years, and as you can see here, there was a kind of a text projection. So even though it was in its infancy, this kind of working with text, it's interesting that it played a large part in my earliest work, but I was frustrated by the idea that this was a proscenium performance. That means that people are on a stage and the public is out there, like now, you're sitting there listening to me. I hope you're not being forced to listen to me. And then I was interested in something more interactive. And so actually, I left the theater world for a period, and I began to work on various installations. This was a very early installation work. I have it seems like I forgot the video here, but it was called The Great Archive. It was a box with layers of text, actually from this book, which was illuminated from below, and this large image is looking into the box, and one could read details of fragments of various biographical information at lower levels by reading between the lines. So normally we think of reading between the lines as a metaphor for, understanding information which is maybe not overt or which is given in the foreground. And so this is an optical play between foreground and background. And in fact, it's so much information for the eyes that when you look into it, you can read a short fact or name or date, but quickly the eyes lose their focus because it's so much text, and also if you're looking to a lower level, and so one is forced to jump and look somewhere else, and that the eye comes onto another level. So in fact, the interactive process of trying to read information or access information is actually reflecting how the brain functions and how we perceive information, that we have to make selections, and then we are faced back with this, somehow sea of information. This is a very early work from 1992. I show this. This is actually also from that period. There's a later version. There's an earlier version of this, which is a text roll. The content of the text roll are information from different institutional archives around the world about the disappearance of information. So at that time, I think I had the bombed library of Sarajevo, mushrooms growing on the walls of different archives, archives lost by war, or there's a term in English, acts of God. It's actually an insurance term to talk about when there's a natural disaster and things are lost. And also in this case, this is 27 meters long. At that time, the text lines are refreshing, so they continue. And it was also very difficult there was the maximum computer power at that time. If you changed a comma, you'd have to wait 24 hours to wait till it finished refreshing. But also in the visual interaction, when you would walk past this thing, you would read a small segment. If I would watch people, and immediately their eyes would get lost and they would start somewhere else. So you were forced to kind of jump from pieces of information to other pieces of information. Okay, I'm not going to show that now. Then I was offered to realize a version of these ideas in 2000 in the Millennium exhibition in Berlin in the Hamburger Bahnhof Museum for Contemporary Art. And I developed this work called the recollection mechanism. And it was the beginning of a whole series of digital works and digital projections, which I've worked on until the current time, in which I work with also computer programmers, coders, to develop the works. I don't do that myself. And in this case, I took this body of biographical material, all these hundreds of biographies, and they were projected by two computers. I'm going to show an old video from that time now. Maybe I just explain it first, that it's two computers, so it's actually in real time, so all of my projection work with text is live. That means the computers are making the decisions live according to a series of variables which are encoded in the software. That means it's not recorded, and which is an important aspect to me. So a kind of a live culling or taking out of the database pieces of information. In this case, there were two computers in a black room, and in the center of the room was a transparent net material. actually I was working with an Italian architect at the time, and we found this kind of Italian metallic screen material which allowed the text to be multiplied. And you could not see the material in the space. So, and then, okay, at that time the video cameras were not so as good as they are now, but the floor and the walls, the text continued on the floor and on the walls. And at the same time, so basically the computer would take a series of words. I had 1,000 words chosen out of the text, and it would randomly choose the next word, and then it would search through the entire database, and it would kind of spin and look for this word, and then it would mark it in the text, and at the moment it was marked, it would speak the word out verbally, or acoustically. So so my interest was to kind of create an experience for a public to mimic or to repeat my own experience in searching through a text. So this searching and finding. So I play a little bit of the video now, and I can drink some water.
Landscapes studied, published, singing, newspaper, break down inventions, elected advocate, library, headquarters, active, newspaper, infantry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So actually, if it was brighter on my computer, you can see the text here on the wall. I'm sorry, on the floor as lines of text, but it's not so visible on the projection.
Lyric, health, nobility, collaborator.
So it was actually an interesting experience making this work, because we had also benches in the space and people sat there for hours sort of in this environment. And I did also continue to develop this idea. This is a work from 2009, or it says 2006. I think it's actually wrong, 2006, but I'm not sure. This was in a space in Berlin. I'm just going to show you it was a round space. Actually, it was a water tower over 150 years old, which had a long, terrible history with people in prison there, Gestapo headquarters. It was during the East German period. They stored fish there, but they also had the secret police kept people there and so forth. So I did archival research and developing information, and in the center of the space, I built a kind of a turntable. It's called Turntable History, and with two projectors that are gradually turning. And the idea was that in software, the letters that were projected were moving in the opposite direction of this turning turntable in the center, so that the impression was that the text was not moving, so that the text was on the walls, as if you would be in a dark space and there would be text written on the walls, and you would go with a flashlight and walk through and illuminate the text. So I'm not sure if that's clear, but let's look at it. Oops, sorry. Here. And maybe I should also say that the sound is a sound of, because there's also something that comes out of my music. I did a number of installations and also music performances with the sound of MRI. I don't know, in German it's MRT, magnetic resonance imaging, to look inside the body. So I made recordings of this magnetic, it's basically electromagnetic energy at a very high rate. So I'll play a little bit of this. Kind of like a scanner, and in fact the MRI is a scanner. So maybe what I didn't explain here is that there's a circle in the center, but then there are what's called vaulted spaces around with arches in between. So it's a very interesting architectural space. Okay, whoops. This is also a work which is actually on the publicity information for this lecture from a work called the Wunderblock. It takes its name from a very important text by Sigmund Freud that was also written about by Derrida as a metaphor for memory. He looks at this children's toy. Okay, most of you are too young to remember this, and I don't know, it may still exist, but it existed also in Freud's time. I grew up with it. It's a kind of a little tablet where there's some cellophane on it. You can write on it and make little drawings, and then when you pull the cellophane up, it disappears. And Freud used it as a metaphor for the unconscious. And because, we receive impressions from the world and then they seem to disappear, but they are engraved in his concept for the unconscious. In this case, and I have to tell you, this is long before, I have a little video here. This is long before there were iPads or anything, so it's actually a hidden computer inside, and one comes into the room and there's this tablet, and here the text is written, somehow comes from below. It's also the Freud text is contrasted with other texts about archival storage. In this case, there's a version in English. There's also a version in German, and the text appear and disappear. It's also, again, there's a database. The database chooses randomly from the various entries and assigns them to a random line and lets them disappear gradually into black with a random time scale. So I often use chance or randomness, but it's a kind of controlled randomness. So there's always one looks at it during the process and sees which range of randomness is effective. Okay, I'm a little bit worried about time, so I'm going to continue. Then a number of projects also in the 90s, beginning with looking at the document. In this one case, the T project that went on for many years, where I did archival research. This had to do with a particular historical personality that lived between the wars, who had multiple personalities and multiple identities and job descriptions. He was a spy, he was a rabbi, he was a priest, he was a businessman, and but he was especially a spy for various governments. I won't go into it in detail now, but I started collecting this information. This has also interested me that finally a biography might look like this. Yeah, these are just lists of documents with archival numbers. And then I actually faked documents. I took some of the most interesting documents, and this was part of an exhibition in the 90s, and printed them with diluted ink on the back of secret police documents I found thrown away at the time of the wall coming down in Germany. What I remember is that there was an archivist in the public who was married to an artist who came to the opening, and she was very angry because she thought I had actually stolen documents from an archive because they looked so real. but then as she started reading the text, it seemed so improbable what was written on them that she thought actually that she thought that they were not, that the information was faked, when in fact it was the opposite. It was the documents that were faked. And then a digital version of that. This is not a video, but where I worked on a sort of a digital display where documents appear and then various material comes up. There is this is. I don't know if you can see anything up there, but the sound is the Morse code, which was recently actually abandoned, but because many of these documents were sent as international cables at the time. So you can see there are searches and texts of documents come up, and let's see. Okay, also I use this possibility of searching, and then a certain word is found, and that document is then shown. This is also kind of automated. Something about these installations that fascinated me, because the computer is making the choices, and you could sit there for days and wouldn't see a repeat. But there's also the idea that if a tree falls in the forest and nobody is there, did it really fall if it was not perceived? And those kind of questions, that a kind of automated data retrieval. And then also related to the document, this is a work where I work with microfilm and microfiche, which is actually a much, I think they say it's lasts maybe 500 to 600 years, they predict, in temperature-controlled atmosphere, as opposed to digital material, which is, of course, questionable. And these are this was an exhibition in a museum with little peepholes, and I found some secret police, Stasi, East German, portable microfiche readers, so that if you were walking around in the street and you suddenly had to read a microfiche, you could take this little thing out of your pocket and hold it up to the sun to read it. And I put these in it, and the text that you see are the I don't know if you have this in France. In Germany, they have the Bureau of Standards. I think you do have this, which defines all things. Like if it's plastic, it defines the kind of, grade of plastic it is. And there's also this kind of text for data destruction. And so the different levels of data destruction. These are two I took out in English. Data destruction, this is the first one, data destruction in which the information carriers are destroyed in such a way that the reproduction of the information reproduced on them is possible without extra technology or extra aids. So, without a huge amount of time. So it could be reproduced. And then level 5, quantum destruction level, which information carriers are destroyed in such a way that it's impossible to reproduce information reproduced on them, according to this technology, which is the state of the art. So, okay, then I just go through a few quick other versions. This is also, I use the metaphor of the card catalog, and in the little windows would normally go X to Z. This is before we had libraries with digital searching. Excuse me. There's digital displays, and also under documents are as if documents are fed in and then they are processed and then read out on the different card cabinets. And here is a more recent work, which is I'm a member of the Academie der Künste, the Academy of Art in Berlin, and which has a huge archive. And they also have it's existed since 1694. It's one of the oldest art academies. I think only the French one is older. And 2,700 members since 1694. And again, I work with the database. This was a commission work where they said, here's the database, could you do something with it? And I developed a work. Again, another work which is dealing with recent German history. I've been commissioned to do a number of works at the Women's concentration camp in Ravensbrück, which has a special connection to France because there were many French inmates, female inmates in this camp, not only, but they were quite well organized after the war. Many French female communists. Whoops, I did a work which I just, whoops, sorry. I'm a little getting lost in my, there should be a video here. Yeah, again, they wanted a chronology. And so I, with the help of some historians, I researched all of the records of events in the camp from its founding to its end. And this information is also displayed relatively randomly, but you get a real sense of what day-to-day life in the camp was. Okay, this is also from this subject matter, similar subject matter in the Jewish Museum, the end of the Jewish community in Berlin. This is a permanent installation which was up for 10 years. It's now been taken down. This is a kind of, the installation is not what's behind. It was installed in a room which had already a display. And these are transparent panels of glass called Privolite, which when current runs through them, they are transparent. And when the current is taken away, they are opaque. That means you can project on them. So information, so basically data from different documents from, actually these were the letters from the Gestapo to the residents of Berlin who were taken away, telling them what they should bring with them. So, and then after the information appears, it goes transparent. And there are 4 different panels. I'm not going to show that. Also another kind of installation working with text. This is so the idea that if it's actually a text from Kierkegaard that says that we recall the past, but we can only live the world forward, but we only understand the world backwards into the past. And it's with the idea, the optical idea, that you can look at a text like this and it creates a kind of little rivers and a landscape. So this was set up in a number of galleries, or shown in a number of exhibitions. And then I want to come to another body of works which I call perceptual works. This is something that's impossible to document when it's really on. And can I just ask about time out there? How much time, because we started late, how much time do I have? Oh my God, 5 minutes. Okay. So perceptual work, this is a flash of text, which the text written on is about something called flashbulb memory, which is the idea that when something happens, for me as an American, it was when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It could be the day when the pandemic, the first lockdown for all of you, when suddenly, you remember exactly where you were when this happened. So it's a kind of a connection of the individual to the collective. And in this installation, actually, the text is flashed in a black room, which I can't document. And it looks like this if you turn the light on. And it's flashing this text, and actually you read the text in the after image because you're blinded by the light in 360 degrees, and then you read further. But these are lenticular works. This was an exhibition related to Walter Benjamin. I'm going to fast forward now a little bit with lenticular works. These are panels that are perceivable from different angles. You read different texts, something like The Little Toys, where you only have 2 different images. This is a high-tech version of that. This was also an exhibition in a number of museums with these works. Here also with text from John Cage at the centennial of his birth. When you look at these different texts appear and disappear, very attractive to me at the time because you didn't need to plug it in. And now I'm going to go to a completely different kind of work, a more recent exhibition, which was at the Neue Berliner Kunstverein in Berlin in 2019, where I looked at individual memory. It's called The Resting State, and it's based on a dialogue among cognitive sciences. It was based on a residency I had at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2016. The resting state is the state at which the brain receives no input. It's kind of like in the waiting room. Yeah, so in the waiting room, so researchers found that when there's no immediate input, that consciousness goes through two phases, which each last approximately 60 seconds. And in one phase, you're kind of at what's called the internal phase. Your memories from the past are coming up, and also you start thinking about the future. I'm supposed to meet so-and-so next week. We're going to go to this restaurant. And then after this number of seconds, it's like a pendulum. You come back to a waking state where you suddenly think, oh, I'm here. It's kind of cold. When are they going to call me with my number, and so forth. So this is something that we all know, and has a lot to do with daydreaming and all this kind of theories. There's a whole dialogue first on one side from the cognitive sciences, and also on the other side from literature and clinical psychologists. So I'm just going to show a little bit of what this room was like. Basically, the lights go on and off according to whether you're in the internal state and the external state, the awareness state. And there's text on the walls. The inside is painted in battleship gray. And then there are films, because I became very interested in how they test this. And so there are text spoken and films from the point of view, the perspective of the doctor or the scientist, and also from the patient. I'm just going to show a little bit of this work, because it's also a more recent work.
Does the past appear physically closer in your mind?
It's a little bit too loud, but...
As much or more from your inability to perform the task as we would from your ability to perform it easily. Something is wrong here, but someone else is saying it.
Sorry, I just go into it a little bit.
They can see I'm not sleeping, but they can't see that I'm talking. My lips aren't moving. They can see I'm not sleeping, but they can't see that I'm talking. My lips aren't moving. Where was I? It was as if someone was standing over me and speaking in a high-pitched voice. Where was I? It was as if someone was standing over me and speaking in a high-pitched voice.
So I unfortunately have to continue. But yeah, I composed the music also for that. Of course, it's a longer experience that one has to get into. There's also a film version of it. Okay, just because there's not much time, I go into, there's also public art projects. For instance, this was a project in Oslo at a site where minorities of all kinds were, well, it's actually a museum for victims of the fascists in the Second World War, but and not only Jews, Roma, Sinti, and so forth. And this was actually the building in which the fascist leader of Norway lived, and they made a museum of it. And I decided to focus on the collection of data, of personal data. And this is a giant. Maybe some of you recognize this as a punch card, which they used to use to collect information from individuals. And it's a monument. It's actually a memorial project. And interestingly, this technology in the 1880s by a German immigrant to the States called Hollerith, who actually invented it to try to determine who was a foreigner, what different minority groups people belong to, actually to categorize humans. So it's called Innocent Questions, with the idea that one is asked this is so relevant today for so many groups, innocent questions that are asked of a public, of individuals from the state, which could lead to them being ostracized or killed. And in fact, in my research for this, I looked at the genocide in Rwanda, which is very much had to do with the identity card that you happen to be carrying, because they couldn't tell necessarily from looking at you whether you were a Tutsi or Tutu. Okay, I go through. I'm going to not go into this, even though I would love to. And this is a recent artwork that also memorial in Munich was part of it, also competition called the Black List, which is in which I collected, made a database of all the books which were burned on this place in 1933 in May. And actually, it's the title of each book, the last book that was published before 1933, and of the forbidden books, and they run without any punctuation in a spiral. You can see it here. So that's a very recent work, May 9, 2021. Okay, there's from above a little film, but yeah, you can see. And then I just want to go through this very quickly. I also, from the performative works, which I can't really show in detail, but I started to develop with a kind of non-proscenium performance structure in which hundreds of people would read from archival text. This is one of the earlier ones. I would create a big archive. It would be a symbolic but functioning archive in which all the papers would be stored, all the files. I would actually kind of, explode the archive or the information and make this incredible filing system, but also with digital readouts here up on the upper left and right. You see also the information, also so a combination of digital and file folders from the institution. Here below on the right is a score for it. So there's a kind of almost a musical score for who reads what text, when, and which table position. I'm not going to show the video now, but here's a recent one that I did. I started doing some of these projects again, 2018 in Switzerland. And here's again a score from one of these projects. In this case, the texts were about this place. I was actually, that's also an example. They said, do something with the history of this town. I worked for a year collecting information, and then people from the village read from the history of their town on different tables. Sometimes there's one, sometimes 4 people reading, sometimes it's always constantly changing. And also there was a sound installation running automatically when the reading was not taking place. Okay, here are the folders. And finally, tomorrow, if some of you are interested in Black Mountain College, so I'm a teacher, so I have been very interested in various models for art education. Again, I was commissioned in 2015 to create a performative work for an exhibition of the first exhibition in Germany about Black Mountain College in the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. And I proposed a combination work performative situation where 11 art schools, and including literature and dance and music and everything, were invited for a residency of 1 to 2 weeks. And in that time they would develop works from the archive. So I built a big archive. I collected for 2 years information about Black Mountain College, which I still have. It's all photocopies, but and then at certain times while they were working, they would, according to a schedule, go out into the exhibition in 4 different locations and read from these archival texts out loud or perform something, you know, sometimes using the text, sometimes inspired by the text. Here's a situation, very intimate. And then lastly, I'm going to end with this project, which is also very recent. This is last spring. So actually it ran from June to August, 4 months, in which I kind of took this idea and then it was further inspired by a work from John Cage called Roly Holy Over, which was one of his last works made for an art museum. And of course, John Cage worked very much with chance operations and choosing by either I Ching or manually or digitally. And I took his idea and applied it to the archive of the Académie des Künste, which is one of the largest art archives in Europe. And according to a score, let's see, where is the score? Wait, hold on, here. Sorry, I don't find it, but yeah, here's a score. The positions of the works which were shown, I chose 70 works, also including video and sound works from the archive, partially randomly, partially through, you know, they could finally show things that are never shown. And then they were changed, the position in the space and on the wall was changed every 2, 3, or 4 days, so according to a score. So it was incredibly complicated. Actually, it was also videotaped on, or not videotaped, it was also former changes which were made were also seen on video here in a kind of closed-circuit TV. There's a score next to it. And there was a depot, which was also the idea of Cage, where everything was stored. This is looking inside the depot. You could look inside it, and you could also sit down and look at various information about the work, look at all the scores, and then people who saw it a number of times, every time they came into the space, they saw a different exhibition, and had very much to do with how the confrontation and collision of artworks, and in this case sometimes documents, with each other creates new worlds. And so rather than people speaking according to the score or acting here, the objects were made to live in a new way. So and it was very, very complicated to do this because there was a whole team of restorers and archivists had to come every time we did the change. We had to develop these vitrines on wheels and make these plexiglass boxes to suit the different works. That was very complicated. And on the wall, this is maybe interesting, we put the nails in on the wall and screws for the entire, according to the score, for the entire 4 months, which is also an interesting image. So you saw these kind of screws and little notes written, so it was all visible. So with that, I stop, okay? We can put the lights on, and if there's anybody still left in the audience after my talk, we can talk. Of course, I only did half of what I wanted to show, but at least you get an impression. I was probably too slow in the beginning, but I need to go fast forward from the beginning. Okay. Yes, so...
Yeah, I've got a question here. I don't know whether this is working all right, is it?
Sorry?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, do you see yourself as a creator or as a channel or a conduit for these other things to come forward through? Because you seem to be working with resources and with randomizing systems. I wonder how you consider your role as either a sort of a conductor or channel, or whether as a primary creator in this.
Interesting question. Yeah, I could see what's behind it. But I guess I believe that the role of the artist has changed. Yeah, or doesn't mean that everyone has to kind of jump into that. But I think that that the role of the artist can be to take what's there and find new ways to experience it, look at it, perceive it in new ways. And I think there are, and it's not actually so new. If you think of artists who've even in modernism, who've used taken advertisements. I mean, if you think back to even Paris in the 1920s or earlier. So there is a tradition of taking materials from the environment and from the culture and kind of reconnecting them, presenting them in unexpected ways. I think that's not something that's only from now, but I think also we live in a different era where the bombardment of images and texts and messages is increasing, and we have our phones and all of that. I don't have to explain to you. So I think that art can reflect that, and I do see myself as a creator. So for instance, I remember one time in a work, I didn't show it today, but one of these reading projects also involved, it was a whole artistic exhibition space in Amsterdam, and the director wanted me to just let everybody search through all the information themselves, and almost as an alternative. And I remember that I felt uncomfortable about that, because I realized that there's something, there is a little subtle message in what I'm doing. So it's not it sounds, that's when I said controlled randomness, yeah? So it's random, but then what's being shown random or displayed, I chose it, yeah? So it's a kind of pre-selection, and then a randomness. It's a combination of a curatorial or the selection of an artist and possibility of a certain chance entering into it, which is also something that we know from the artistic process in some way, even though we may not make that the focus of our work. So what I'm trying to say is that that there's something from me in all this work. So if someone else did the same works, I think it would come out very differently. And for instance, in this last work, I had a lot of fun choosing a lot of the objects. I contrasted works by famous artists with just some random piece of concrete that was found in the corner of a atelier and then found its way into the archive. So, and I tried to create little messages in this. So, for instance, I wanted certain things to be discussed. I specifically chose I had material from the Académie des Künste from the 1930s, like an art catalog of Italian fascist art with a picture of Mussolini on the cover. I specifically chose particular information coming from, or material coming from certain periods, certainly that the East Germany would be represented. And I also chose random things that just caught my eye, so which is also what I think is part of the artistic process, and try to make them combine and rearrange themselves over time. So I really, and then it also reminds me of, what's his name, Kenneth Goldsmith, who writes books which are just actually texts which already exist. So there is something to be said for, maybe there's already enough in the world and we can just kind of rearrange what we have. I don't know if that's a question mark, but I think also the definition of the artistic process has grown, and even in cases where I might have problems with it. So I mean, there were situations even with my students where I learn from my students because they come up with something that I have to question myself: is that art or not? And that's a really interesting situation to be in, where we don't really know. And certainly, those questions and works which rose out of that question from 30 years ago are now in the canon. So I think that's something that's always changing. And I think I always told my students, you should surprise me. Yeah, show me something I could never expect, you know, that I wouldn't, that would have really far into my own practice, you know. So I think, I think that's can be positive to question, you know, our role, and I also think as opposed to some of my colleagues, when I think because I'm now in a school, right, an art school, some of my colleagues really know what art is. Yeah, I understood that, but I'm not really sure. Yeah, so I know what art interests me. I know what art was, and that's a question. Yeah.
So does that speak directly to the first picture you showed us with memory lost? Is that?
Okay. Yeah. There's actually the story of that, which I didn't tell, was that I made it as an exhibited photograph in an exhibition later, but my first instinct, I had an exhibition shortly after that in Italy, a year after, and I got this call. It was in Milano, and the gallerist said, "Just can you send a picture quickly? I need it this afternoon, you know." And I had no time to think, and I remembered this photograph, so I just sent it to him. And we called the exhibition "Memory Lost." And then of course, this was sent all around, and I started getting all these, emails from people saying, that's interesting, your new work. Was that from an art competition, or how much did you get for putting that up? When did you, set that up? So it was like suddenly the whole idea of what it was also misunderstood, but I found that misunderstanding really interesting. Because we also know that it's also historical fact that in our tradition that, artists have, just taken a ready-made that was there and then it was their own. I mean, that's old. So, but that's not the main message of my work, but I think it's something that I have to always remain conscious of. I don't ask myself whether this is art, but okay, we all try to make something that people will respond to. Yes, sir.
To help me to understand what art is, can you synthesize why you do what you do in few sentences?
Oh, if I could do that, then I would be really. You want me to give you a encapsulated version of why I do what I do, huh? You want to see me what? Try. Cry or try? Try it live. Why I do what I do. Actually, my father was a watchmaker, but he was he loved classical music, but he couldn't play music at all, and so I often think that maybe the music part comes. They took me to classical music concerts all the time, and he listened to his hi-fi all the time, very high. And if I would peek in, I would see him conducting from the hi-fi. And my mother was a painter. It's a complicated story, but from what's called the Ashcan School. It was from social realism, okay, and she studied with some of the major figures, Art Students League in New York, and she never really had. She had a limited success, but she had gallery shows, and so I was kind of brought up in this milieu, and so I can say that even when I didn't know what I was going to do, it was always clear to me it was going to be something in this blob called arts or creative work. I mean, even when I couldn't define it. I mean, as young as I was, I grew up in the 60s. It was New York. I was cutting school and going to MoMA. But I also cut school and go to the Museum of Natural History. And it was an explosive time. So already when I was in high school, I mean, I was, somehow in this world, even though I didn't really understand what it was. So I don't think there was ever, that what I'm trying to say is that even when I was unclear what my output was going to be and what medium, and I moved, and I've actually, my whole life, I've moved from thing to thing. So you see, it's like, I only showed some of it now, but I've changed my identity a lot, my artistic identity, quite a number of times, and in what world I want to be in as an artist. Is it more performance-oriented? Is it theater? Is it music? Is it installation? Is it this or this? But the continuum is that I think, if you would tie me up, I would find some way. I mean, I think I'm always thinking of doing something. So, and so that's maybe the automatic aspect of it. That it's in one, and then so it comes out, and then it's channeled. But and if you ask me why I'm doing really this, like what I showed. Yeah, I mean, there's many reasons. No, actually, it's not about reasons, really. So it's about interest. So one interest takes one to the next interest. That's really is hard to talk about. How does one get attracted to something, or to a format of working, or to a particular medium? In some cases, it was as simple. When I was young, I've told my students that that in my experience, sometimes just being around a particular artist or composer or whatever, it may be seeing a work, coming in contact with a work, it may be actually having a conversation with somebody, or it might be even sweeping the floor. Like, for instance, I worked for Namjoon Paik in the 70s, and I actually cleaned the floor, which was really ridiculous because my wife still complains when I clean the floor. It's not clean enough. And I worked for his wife also. And sometimes there would just be a moment we would just sit around and talk. He would make something to eat, and those are really important moments for me. And I've had those moments, and sometimes that moment is enough. Sometimes that moment is as much as 6 years of art school. Yeah, so it's hard to say what's quantitatively more important, and sometimes the contact with someone can be very short. I'm saying it's not about duration. It's maybe more about intensity, and as a receiver, is one ready for that? Is one there are. I was around a lot of very interesting artists historically. I mean, so in different periods, and I can think back at times I wasn't really open to it. I mean, even in the presence of certain people where I thought, no, I'm not really, I'm not interested in that. I was closed to it, but I could have opened to it, but I wasn't really ready to kind of receive it, or, in my own development, or understanding of what work is. So, it may be an important message. And the lesson, and about Black Mountain, that will be interesting to talk about, because it's a utopian experiment. It lasted quite a long time and had a lot of problems, but it's interesting to look at what they tried, and where they failed, and why they failed, and what the experience was. But, for instance, there were certain students and artists who were teachers at Black Mountain, I just say this, who were there for a very short time, and it changed their lives totally, forever, sometimes maybe a summer or like a week course. And so that's, yes, sir, I see a hand back there. Hello.
I would be interested in the memorials that you created.
Yeah.
You stand to that, because it's like a thing that stands for a community, but it's also a piece of art, so could you talk about that?
It stands for a community. Oh.
Yeah, I don't know if it's that it might, it's connected to the history of people.
Yes. So, okay, of course, one feels a certain responsibility in those cases, yeah? So, I mean, especially in general, I would say when one is using information which is, I don't want to use the word real, but at least recorded, and it has to do with people's lives, of course there's a responsibility there. And yes, I have done a number. I didn't show all of them. I've done a few others. There's also a work in the Stasi prison in Berlin, I've gotten into trouble with those who are sponsoring it or paying for it, who want to censor what information, especially in my case, because I generally don't work with a symbolic object. I mean, there are memorials which are symbolic statements, and I generally don't do that. I mean, in that same way where it's, so I work a lot with text. And so then it's a question, what text will be shown, yeah? And will that be insulting to some member of the population? So I have to deal with those kind of situations. And I have to decide whether I agree to it, that I will reduce or take out certain information, or I say no, then I don't do it. I mean, that's something that I have to deal with every time. But of course, in terms of, I think, public art, okay, in the sense of public art, as we understand a work which is in the public space, especially if it's durational, like, lasts for a long time, then there's a responsibility in what is the interaction. There's a lot of interesting texts about that. So, to what degree do you disorient the public, or, I don't know, insult the public, or, what is, how does that interaction take place, and what is, what kind of interaction is desired. But it's definitely, I will say in general, taking work, I mean, what's very different is work which is in an artistic context. That means in an art museum, in an art space, where the audience is somehow comes with a certain more or less shared knowledge, I say more or less because it's not always same, but somehow understands that because it's in the context of this building or this video program or whatever, that it's understood in a certain way. But when you put something out in the street, it's a whole nother situation. So, that's something that needs to be talked about and thought about, yeah? So, of course, I'm happy when I see a general public interacting and responding to a work I've made in the public space. I think that's, I feel that it works, that it can work intellectually for those who have a full knowledge of art history, for instance, or know the historical background, but it can also function for those who just walk by and know nothing and don't even know what an artwork is, yeah? So I think that's an interesting space to be in. It's not easy to do that, so I don't want to say that I've always been successful at that. It also comes to play not only in the public space, but in a non-art space, but which is also a museum, like a history museum or something like this, where the public is not, may or may not have any contact to the format of artistic presentations, as we know it. And so you have a different kind of a public. But, and I'm not saying that one should only pander to the public, so, but it's at least something that comes up as a question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so, but I also wanted to know, like, the relation, I don't really know how to say it.
It's okay.
Because it's kind of a collective thing, but behind this, there's like one artist. Is this like, have you, like, I don't really know how to...
Like, what is my role in relation to the work, or...
Yeah, and maybe to the history.
Aha.
Like, so, for instance, the burned books.
Yeah.
Is it sometimes problematic to you? Do you have, like, that you may not have, like, a relation to this part of history?
Problematic in what sense? In that I don't want to work with this history, or?
No, I don't know if problematic is the right word, but is it difficult, maybe?
Well, okay, I mean, of course it can be difficult. I mean, the most difficult work I didn't show here recently as an example, also in Ravensbrück, I was invited to an exhibition by a young artist, French artist, Dominique Hurt, who lives in Berlin. And she'd done a lot of research about the French inmates of Ravensbrück. And in Ravensbrück there are the houses, this is to show you how difficult this is, the houses, the residencies of the SS women guards, female guards, because they had female guards to guard the female prisoners, and they made a new exhibition in one of these houses. It was actually the house where they were trained also, and these houses look like Bavarian Swiss houses. They look very, there's a good term in German for this, but maybe you know what I mean. They look like places where people live, and a little bit folk style, like German, Austrian folk style kind of thing. And then Dominique got support from the government to make an artistic intervention in this exhibition, and I was one of the artists. So, we knew each other already, and then I go there, and suddenly I realize this is the first work that I'm confronted with where it's actually about we would say the perpetrators and not the victims. Yeah, so because you're in this house where these women lived, and you can see out the window right into the camp. So so they were basically sleeping and eating and looking out above the walls into the camp. So of course comes the question, how could they do this? And so that was a very difficult project, I thought, for me. And in the end, I didn't do anything about this particular direct history, but I made 2 films. One, which is I researched speeches by directors of women's organizations. These were Nazi women's organizations to the women who lived at that, in the country, and went through women's magazines. These women's magazines had like sewing instructions and recipes and things like this, but the texts were often written to the women, to to develop fascist women. And of course, through this project, even we can intellectually imagine, you think, how could the people do this? But then I understood, looking through these magazines, weeks of looking through these magazines, that how penetrating this fake news is. Yeah, how this is also relevant today, that people lived, it was just through repetition, people were confronted in every part of their lives through the media. This is maybe the first modern state using media, radio, and magazines, mass media to spread the message. But they were confronted with it at every step of their lives, constantly. And of course, that has an effect. And it's interesting thinking of Russia now today and many other situations with this, you wonder how a population can do what they did. So, and of course the situation in the States, with Fox News, that's something like that. Of course there are other, and how media today makes, or somehow the way media is distributed, somehow induces us to be in our own very small channel. Yeah, so it can, and it can coincide with other channels. So that was very difficult. So I had a radio speaker, a woman, read these texts to the camera and look directly in the camera. So just looking at how this information, how they talk to the female population. And the other video was about child rearing. And I don't go into this in real detail, but I found some interesting books dealing with, there was actually a book written by a famous doctor about how to raise your child in the Nazi time, and so also a women's theme. And this book was a bestseller during the Nazi time, and with a few minor corrections, a bestseller in the 50s in Germany, and is now being claimed as a reason, having an impact on the 60s generation in Germany. Anyway, so I try to look at it more generally and more general themes rather than dealing with a specific theme. So yes, it can be difficult. And I have also refused some possibilities to work with this kind of information where I felt that I didn't have the support to work freely, and where I felt there was a preconceived notion of what should be the result, so which is problematic, of course. And there's a lot of cliches that people have to work with. But yes, if you live in Germany, you're constantly, connected to this somehow, connecting it because I work a lot with historical themes. So I don't want to give the impression that that's, you know, I mean, I showed you a lot of different works, and but it has come up. I'm occasionally asked to work with that kind of material.
Thank you.
Yeah.